will be
Recording in
available
progress.
on Community Action and YWCA YouTube.
I think we may have lost Neil. Hopefully he will be able to return soon. I believe that was the conclusion of his introductions for this evening. Good evening, everyone. So excited that you were able to join us for our new season of Courageous Conversations. We run from June to July, and we took August off because we had yoga in the park. So it's so good to be back together on the fourth Monday. Tonight, I'm so excited to welcome my friend and nonprofit colleague, Mr. Marc Perry, Executive Director of Community Action, Inc. of Walworth and Rock County. Marc is going to be our guest speaker tonight. He's going to walk us through the evening. I will handle the mechanics behind the scene. If you, for some reason, have to leave or accidentally fall off the meeting, I will be happy to let you back in. Also, if you have questions or comments while Marc is presenting, please do go ahead and put those in the chat. You have a couple different options. You can put them in the chat for everyone to see. I'll kind of bundle those, and as Marc pauses for questions, I'll have those ready for him. Or if your question is personal in nature, you can go ahead and direct message me. We will discuss the content of the question without revealing you as the source. All right, Marc, I have said more than enough. I yield the floor to you, my friend. Get us started, please.
Thank you, Amy, and thanks everyone for having me. Really appreciate this opportunity. So this evening we're going to do in kind of three different acts. So first, talking about fiction and sci-fi fantasy. So what we're going to talk about in that first circumstance is some of the pushback about BIPOC individuals being cast in roles that were historically, or in fiction and fantasy characters that people historically have identified as white. The second part of this is we're going to talk about excluding stories and excluding information from people of color and from people from other cultures and communities by banning books, banning poems, and banning plays. The third component of this series we will talk about this evening. We'll talk about what's going on in some of our school districts across the country as revisionist history is being introduced around a number of topics. Slavery and racism being one significant one. People rewriting World War II history, people rewriting history of the Old West, and eliminating aspects of that history that some people have deemed harmful, or have deemed that some people are not ready to hear or understand. I'm a firm believer that history is history, so we need to tell the whole truth. But there are those who feel like certain aspects of our history need to be eliminated, or told in certain other ways, or diminished in certain ways, even to avoid the feelings and sentiments of some people who feel as if that history is maybe harmful or detrimental. The reality of it is history is what it is. So we need to tell the whole story and let people judge for themselves, as opposed to deciding to eliminate certain aspects of history. So where we're going to start this evening is we're going to start with what I am calling the discussion about the Little Mermaid. So what we're going to share with you is an audio clip from a story by Forbes magazine. I don't know if many of you are familiar with the fact that the backlash that's happened from that Disney has received because they cast a person of color in the role of Ariel in the Little Mermaid live action movie. So I'm going to share this audio clip with you with a report of Forbes magazine, and then share some more information, and then we can have some discussion and dialogue about it. So hopefully this works. Can everybody see the screen?
We can.
Yeah.
All right. And
Disney's Little Mermaid, Backlash Has Reached Insane Heights. By Donnie D. Placido. Disney's latest live-action remake, The Little Mermaid, has been engulfed in controversy ever since the casting of singer Halle Bailey was announced. While Disney's tepid remakes always receive criticism from nostalgic fans, this time, the backlash is transparently racist, with all of the negativity aimed at the casting of a non-white actress to play the titular mermaid. The film's trailer has been flooded with 1.5 million dislikes from angry fans. Despite YouTube removing the dislike counter, the numbers are still available through an extension. Comment sections have exploded with absurd talking points, defending the sanctity of the original Danish story, which Disney's original animated adaptation sanitized almost beyond recognition. The discourse peaked when one terminally online Twitter user used an AI to paint over Bailey's face with that of a white redhead, and assured anxious fans that he would correct the full movie upon release. While toxic fandom has been an issue for several years now, one has to wonder, how on earth did we get here? How did we get to the point where thousands of grown men are furious about a movie made for 8-year-old girls? Of all the cultural battlegrounds to fight this war, why choose Disney's damp, lifeless remakes? There is much to criticize about nostalgia culture, but from Disney's perspective, it makes a lot of sense to relive their glory years. Ignoring a few duds, many of their live-action remakes have made a gargantuan amount of money at the box office. Never mind the fact that these films lack the vibrant energy, color and expressiveness of their animated originals. People will happily take their kids to see them in theaters, hoping to feel a fraction of that childhood magic. Disney is milking its fattest cows again, just like when it pumped out all of those direct-to-video sequels in the 90s. The company is making billions doing so, but it's also being pulled into the orbit of some really intense culture wars, with seriously weighty topics being debated in the same breath as singing mermaids and wishing stars. Imagine, if you will, being a child right now, and going online to look for news about your favorite Disney princess, and seeing adults writing unhinged manifestos about how melanin can't develop underwater. What must they think of us? When 90s kids watched The Lion King 3, Hakuna Matata and The Little Mermaid 2, Return to the Sea, the worst they were subjected to was a shoddily made animation, rather than a frenzy of feverish discourse around race and gender that regurgitates great replacement talking points. Is this where nostalgia culture is taking us? Is mining old IP, aimed at pleasing parents, children and Disney adults, alike exposing something rotten lurking beneath the surface? Clearly, lonely and frustrated men are being sucked down propaganda pipelines, to the point where they are triggered by the sight of a non-white actress playing a mermaid in a kid's movie. These people desperately need to log off and go outside. Thankfully, toxic manchildren haven't managed to dominate all of the discourse. In response to the flood of negativity, parents are pushing back, posting videos of their children excited by the sight of a Disney princess who looks like them. After all, this movie was made for children, not embittered adults, and I'm not sure why grown men would think otherwise. Disney's Little
So I'm not sure how many of you are. I've been following media, following social media the last couple of months. How many of you were aware of the discourse around The Little Mermaid? You can put in the chat or raise your hand. A lot of people. Yeah. The reason why I wanted to bring this up this evening because it's becoming a pattern of people being cast in certain roles or people playing certain roles in the community or in movies or in TV, and then there being some kind of cultural backlash. And it's centered around primarily people of color playing roles that in others' imaginations are supposed to be white roles. So the Little Mermaid one was kind of my last straw because I'm thinking it is a fictional Disney character. And as you heard, 1.5 million dislikes on Disney's YouTube page. 1.5 million people protesting against a fantasy character. This isn't the first time this has happened. It's just the most recent circumstance. Just a couple of months ago, when the Game of Thrones prequel was released, people were up in arms because there were Black people in Westeros, I guess is the name of the world. And then then we had people upset when we were doing the prequels and the sequels for Star Wars because they were Black and brown people in a galaxy far, far away. And now the other thing that people are upset about is that there are Black hobbits in Middle Earth in the prequel to Lord of the Rings. What does this say about us as a society and as a community? And and this is an honest conversation because I am not white. So what is it about seeing people of color in those roles that is so upsetting and so offensive to white people?
So I'm not
Why
white
the backlash?
either, Mark, but I'll chime in a little bit. There are 35 of us here, which is fantastic. So if you want to join into the conversation, either put a question mark in the chat and then I'll know the order to call on people. Let's stick to that one because if we get a second page and you raise your hand, I might miss you. So just drop a question mark in the chat. And to answer the question partially, if I may, I think art imitates life. And so why wouldn't we be surprised that this visceral emotion has seeped into sci-fi and fantasy, etc. And the thing that I picked out from that article that we listened to is toxic fandom. And we, unfortunately, I mean, we have that in some cases in our community over certain issues and certain individuals. We have toxic fandom and the way that shows up. So I will mute myself, but everyone else, please do feel free to jump in and go ahead and drop a question mark in the chat. All right, we have Sarah. Go ahead and unmute.
Hi, thanks so much for doing this. I'm excited to be here and I'll get us started here. I've kind of asked myself this question, like, what the is wrong with people that they really are getting hung up on stuff like this? And the language in that article that kind of came to mind, or that maybe opened my eyes a little bit, is this idea that we have so much nostalgia culture. I didn't have language for that, but I know that this is a thing where people are like, oh, I want my G.I. Joe lunchbox, or I want my Power Rangers lunchbox, or I want to put my kids in, Nintendo shirts, or, like whatever it is. Like, this seems to be the case. And I'm guessing, like, my understanding is that most hatred comes from fear. And I'm thinking to myself, like, if people really to me, the point behind nostalgia is to like go back to easier, happier times when I wasn't a bill-paying adult who had a mortgage and kids and all the things. And so my guess is that people who get uptight about this stuff, like, they just want to go back and remember how it was when they watched The Little Mermaid the first time, right? They don't want to think about like, oh wait, BIPOC have been oppressed since, I don't know, 400 years ago or so. And like, when people start to mess with those norms, like, instead of Ariel being this thin, beautiful, fair-skinned redhead, and now she's it's like, in the white mind, I think we have put so much baggage on Blackness that we've assumed that these are always folks who are experiencing oppression, and they don't have the kind of joy that would go along with being a mermaid who wants to like meet a man she loves. So I don't know, that's me speculating because this is not a perspective that I share. Like, I'm like psyched to hear that there's, folks of color showing up in our nostalgia, but thank you for letting me share. I'll pass.
In order to get ready for this, I did some, because nostalgia culture was a newer term to me too, until I started researching some of this. And there is some reality and validity to that sentiment, that feeling, those beliefs about holding on to things that from your childhood, from your youth, that are really valuable to you, that you love to see, you love to hear, old music, old movies, old cartoons, all of those things. There is some validity to that, but what's missing about this conversation is understanding that the original movie is still out there. Like, anybody who wants to watch the original movie still can. Anybody who wants to watch the original cartoons still can. It's not like they've taken those cartoons, that movie away and locked it away in a vault somewhere. You can go buy it like right now. So for those who are still interested and engaged in the original version of it, you can still do so. But for those people who want to see something new or something different, they have that option as well. It's not part of the nostalgia cultures I've been reading about is it's a lot of either or as opposed to and both. You can have both of these things and celebrate them both and think they're both incredible, or you can just like the thing that you like without disparaging the new thing that's coming out.
Mhm.
Mark, I think that's a really great point that you just brought up. It's like Black Ariel takes something away from the original. You don't have to go see the movie. You do all of the things you just listed. But I think that's really interesting. And I don't know what direction you want to send us in if we're going to dig into that. But why are people threatened by it is the question for me.
Well, that's exactly it, because it is, you know, I think one of the first times I was really conscious of this was probably, I was saying it was 3 or 4 years ago. I read an article about a Macy's department store in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania that had a Black Santa Claus. And the protesting and the uproar that came out of the fact that that Macy's Santa Claus was Black, and that parents were screaming and protesting and yelling at and really upset about the fact that this Macy's decided to make their hire a Black Santa Claus, and they wanted their kids to see the real Santa Claus.
Mhm.
And go ahead, Amy, go ahead.
No, I'm just gonna let that sit. Like the spoiler alert, if there are any children listening in, please tune off now. Like Santa is not a thing that is real, but they want them to see the real Santa Claus. Just made me giggle a little bit. Zakia in the chat dropped a question mark. Please go ahead and join the conversation.
Sure. I think it's more so about, we go to the primitive place of survival. And when whiteness is threatened and sort of replaced, even subconsciously, white people start to think about their own survival and possible extinction. So the more they see individuals take their place, or even cartoons or something white replaced with Blackness, it feels like sort of an affront in that they're shrinking in numbers. And we can see that from a lot of the protests that are going on now with regard to whoever will not replace us, because there is sort of an attitude that whiteness began humanity, which, by the way, it did not. But there's that idea of extinction. So going back to your idea about fear, there's a fear of really being forgotten as a white race. So the more you have diversity, the more people get scared of themselves being pushed out and not represented. And I don't think they think about the oppressions of BIPOC people at all when these things happen. I think the people that make these comments don't care about Black people being oppressed. I don't even think they think that's true, to be honest with you. I think it's very much about looking at their own survival, which primitively we always care about our own survival. But it's just an awful way to sort of get their point across.
Thank you. So
Yeah.
sorry, Mark. The chat is alive, and when I get these in and then pass the floor after Neil, right back to Mark. But we have Susan, Jean, Bridget, and Neil, and then we'll go to Mark, and then anyone after that, I'll take you in the next round. Susan, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Sorry. Yes, I really like what Zakiya just said. It's a deep-seated fear that is totally irrational. And I mean, I've been thinking about this recently because of another conversation I've had with Marc recently. And the thing is, I'm not sure when the racism really started, but it is thousands of years old. And then when America was settled by the whites, very much late in the game, but they like took over. And then ever since the colonies turned into the states, ever since the colonies started, I mean, the white has been taken as a default for people, for any people. That's how deep the racism went. And so with seeing the movements and the changes, we are seeing some change now in our time. It's not exactly what I would like to see, but it has been some change. And I think that's what deepens the fear again and brings that all up to the surface, is the fear of being left behind or being replaced, kind of thing. I think that is true, but that white was taken as a default for people. And so whites tended to not even think of themselves as any particular thing. They just thought, well, white is the norm, so we're the norm, and whoever is different then is not the norm. So I mean, it is all fear. It's all irrational fear, and we just have to keep educating. I mean, that's the only thing I know.
Thank you, Susan. Jean, go ahead and unmute.
I'm giving the floor to Santo.
So when I see The Little Mermaid, what I see is nostalgically elevating white people. And when you put Halle Berry in there, you're putting someone in there that our society historically has done a good job denigrating. So she represents everything we have worked really hard at trying to keep in place, and that is Blackness. And historically, Blackness has been viewed in our country as a negative. So when you start, and I know, Mark, I have an idea where you may be going with this, but historically, we've done a good job putting Black people in negative light. And Little Mermaid elevates Black people. So you got 1.5 million people saying, oh, this is bad, 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 because they don't want to accept change. They don't want to accept the change that we have discussed historically. You know, and in my lifetime, I've seen change, but it's just so slow in trying to treat people with dignity and respect, regardless of their skin color, regardless of melanin, et cetera, et cetera. So when I see something like The Little Mermaid or any other kind of media that puts Black people in a positive light and people bashing it, you know, they're not ready to accept the change that is necessary and I hope inevitable.
Thank you, Santo. And another thing about change is, unfortunately, it's not linear. We'll hear from Bridget and then Neil, and then I will pass the floor back to Mark. Rose and Yvonne, I haven't forgotten about you, but I'll start with you at the next break. Bridget, go ahead and unmute, please.
Hi, can you guys hear me okay?
We can.
Okay, great. So I'm listening and hearing everything everyone is saying, and I wonder sometimes if we aren't being too kind by saying that it's fear of losing, or fear of being replaced, or fear of being left behind, or fear of change. I think that's maybe some of it, but like I said, I wonder if it's not being too kind by saying that, because I think it's more of the fear of these people losing the hate and the power of hate. They seem so consumed with hate that they are willing to, they don't have really any substantial reasoning. There's no reasoning ever for hate, but they for what they're doing about, and what they're saying, I guess I don't want to go any further. I'm just saying, I think it's too kind to say it's just as simple as being that white people are being fearful of being replaced or left behind, or that we're afraid of change. I think it's more, it's just the hate. They want the hate to perpetuate, and they want to create more hate and more discord and more just, they're hateful. I don't know what else to say. I think it's just that.
Well, Bridget, thank you. And I think you said a lot, and that is a really interesting perspective that I'm sorry that I agree with, that people are afraid of the hate kind of subsiding. It's like, nope, we need to put another log on that fire. We got to keep this growing. Yeah, that's powerful. All right, we will hear from Neil, and then Marc, the floor is yours.
Hi, before we go on to the next step, I hope that you will read the post that Jamie put in the chat to everybody about Jesus. But what I want to say is white fragility. That's totally different from what Bridget said, and I think that's okay because there's lots of different parts of this. But the thing that amazes me is how white people can be so fragile when we've been in charge and have been in power all this time. How is it that we're so fragile in the process? Anyway, that's my thought.
Thank you for that, Neil. The thing that I instantly thought about is that power doesn't make you strong. So you can be in power and very much be fragile. I think obstacles and unfortunately oppression and endurance, those are the things that make you strong, and build resiliency, although it's not optimal. But yeah, power doesn't equate strength. So the post that Neil was referring to says, white Jesus with blue eyes and blonde hair, not reality. Jesus was from the Middle East and would have had dark skin and dark hair. All right, Marc, the floor is yours.
So, Amy, thank you. Thanks to everyone for your comments. I was writing down notes as people were talking. So first and foremost, Amy, the comment that you made about power. One need only study South African apartheid to understand exactly what you're talking about, that you can be in control, you can have the power or you can have the influence and impact, but that influence and impact and that power is fragile because the way that it was gained was false, and the way that it was held on to for decades was maintained by brutality and lies, and eventually that crumbled. So there was no substance, there was no foundation for that power, so it was not long lasting. Also thinking about, Zakia, what you had to say about fear, about people being eliminated and people being replaced. So here is some real world data for everybody. Children of color now represent the majority of children in the United States. By the year 2030, the majority of the United States workforce will be people of color. By the year 2042, no single group will constitute a majority of people in the United States. Whites will be about 43%, the other 57% will be made up of various persons of color. So I do think that there is a level of fear that exists in terms of being replaced, because real numbers play that out. But I also have to say that perpetuation of hatred and anger is absolutely real. I think it is very much an and both in this circumstance. It is the fear of being replaced, but that fear is very much being driven by hatred, bias, and bigotry. It is unfortunate that we are in a circumstance where we continue to have these conversations about young people of color taking on roles that historically people didn't see us in. And that we're having the conversations about sci-fi fantasy. I was having this debate with a person a few days ago, and they brought up The statement was, well, what if they made a white person black? They put a white person in the role of Black Panther. And my response to them was, the person's race is central to the role, so it's actually Black Panther. So you would not do something like that because it's central to the character itself. Whereas a mermaid could be purple with pink polka dots. So understanding the difference between those things. What's also come up in conversations I've had is, well, what if you put a white person in a movie and that white person was playing Malcolm X, or that white person was playing Martin Luther King? And I'm like, actual people as opposed to fictional Disney characters, totally different, completely, totally, and utterly different. If you're going to actually portray a person, you want to actually use an actor of that race or ethnicity, it just makes sense. But if I'm portraying a fictional character from Disney or from a book, couldn't that person be any race or ethnicity? The other day I was watching the Shakespeare. There's a Shakespearean troupe in New York it's an African American Shakespearean troupe, and they were doing, the play was on PBS, and they were doing Much Ado About Nothing. And I'm watching this entirely African American cast perform this Shakespearean play, and it was just amazing and incredible. And did Shakespeare see Black people performing his plays? Maybe not. But how awesome for kids in 2022 to see Black people performing his plays. Part of that nostalgia is rooted in something that we need to learn how to let go of. Yes, I love reading Shakespeare. I love seeing old movies. I love going back and watching it, seeing the plays. They're awesome. But when I flipped that on the other night, it made me feel a certain way. It was uplifting to see the mastery of the language, of the play itself, the setting that they put it in, the backdrop, that to make it culturally responsive was incredible. And it still was true to Shakespeare, but it was very much Black Harlem at the same time. Again, we can do this and make it and both. I could sit there and watch and enjoy the beautiful language of William Shakespeare, but also enjoy the artistry of these African-American actors portray this in a way, in a setting that was very much 2022 or 2020 Harvard or Harlem, New York. And it was just incredible to see the marriage of the two. And there was nothing out of place about it. Or at least in my mind, there was nothing out of place about it. But sitting there watching that the other night, thinking to myself, are there people watching this thinking that there's something out of place about it?
Mm-hmm. Incredible point. So Marc, with your permission, I took notes when you were starting. We have 3 sections. So are you okay with shifting us towards banned books? But before we do that, I want to kind of clear the decks as far as comments. So we'll hear from Rose, Yvonne, and then Zakia, and then we'll shift into your next section. Rose, you can go ahead and unmute.
My first thing was to go off of Neil's point. I think that one of the reasons white people get so offended is we are so used to punching down that when we get challenged on it, there's a tendency to shut down and try to justify the hate with false rage about things that don't actually, like the Little Mermaid could be with polka dots. She's a mermaid, but it reflects in real world applications, which ties into my other thing. I grew up in Madison, and at high school, I noticed a steep change because I went to a middle school where I was one of 5 white people in the school. And so I was used to like the power structures being different at that school. And then I got to high school where it was a bunch of different middle schools, a bunch where it was entirely white with only a few Black children there. And the white kids that went to the middle schools that were entirely white were very confused as how power structures changed in high school when there was a little more of a balance. And it took them time to adjust. And some of them didn't adjust. They were just like, I'm just going to wrap myself in my hate like it's a protective shield and zone everyone else out. Yeah.
Rose, thank you for contributing that. Yvonne, go ahead and unmute.
I'm going back also to Jamie's comment about the white blue-eyed Jesus. And it made me think of the book by James Cone, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And where, you know, I think back over how could Black people relate to this white Jesus? And the book talks about the fact that the cross and the lynching tree were both objects of terror and torture and execution. And they felt that, from what the book said, that Jesus would understand. But I also was thinking about if a Mediterranean Jesus was the one who had been the picture that many of us would have, with the identification, would people be able to identify with Jesus like they do when he's white? I just appreciated Jamie really bringing that up.
No, thank you for sharing that. Zakiya, go ahead, and then we will turn the floor over to Marc.
I just wanted to make a point to piggyback off of the women that said we're sort of being too kind and saying that it's fear, which I absolutely agree with. White supremacy has always just been something that was foundationally American. And because you have that sort of power, you don't want to let it go, because honestly, white people are still the global minority. And just to circle back about where we started this conversation with Ariel and a Black Ariel, that goes back to very much revisionist history, or even history that we didn't know or people didn't teach us about ourselves, because even people will have this argument that Ariel was from some random place. Well, all mermaid folklore started with the Njuzu people of Togo and Benin. So if we want to play that game, like the original mermaids were Black. So if that will be a much larger argument or larger conversation, because if you want historical accuracy, you're completely wrong about a white Ariel, because there were no white mermaids in folklore, or if however you want to believe in existence, because those specifically came from Togo and Benin off the Ivory Coast.
Thank you. Marc, the floor is yours. Take us to section 2, please.
Thank you all for your comments thus far, and thank you for the the lesson as well, because that West African folklore is lost it gets often lost, and certainly isn't taught in any school that I attended. So thank you for that. So I'm going to share my screen one more time as we switch gears and we start talking about books that have been banned over the last couple of years. More and more books written by people of color, more and more books written from people from the LGBTQ community are being banned in schools all over the country. I'm going to share some data with you. Those who know me know that I love data. So I'm going to share some information with you with the screen here. All right, can everybody see the screen that says, it says across the country, more books have been challenged and removed as religious conservative groups target LGBTQ and race issues. So Texas, so Texas, Florida, Oklahoma are 3 states that have been notorious for banning books, especially over the past 3 years. As it says, Texas has banned more books from school libraries this past year than any other state in the nation, targeting titles centering on race, racism, abortion, LGBTQ representation, and issues according to so they're pushing that we want this out of our schools. They're banning you can't use the term gay in certain communities. Can't use the word queer in the state of Oklahoma in a school setting. As it says, Texas has banned 801 books across 22 school districts, and 174 titles were banned at least twice. So it wasn't enough to ban it once. We don't like it, we're going to ban it for multiple reasons. Um, let's see. So next up, as it says, 1,648 unique titles have been banned by schools across the country. 41% of those books that have been banned addressed LGBTQ themes, and another 40% of the books that have been banned contain protagonists or prominent secondary characters of color. So again, a specific emphasis on banning books that talk about LGBTQ concerns or books that have a protagonist or a secondary character that is a person of color, pulling those books off the shelves and not exposing them to our youth. I'm going to share with you this list, and then I'll turn it back over to Amy so we can talk about. So this is the first list that I pulled of several. So this is the top 10 most challenged books or banned books from 2021. Everybody is checking to look those over. So I'm hoping that as you look at this list, you recognize some books that you have read, that you recognize some books that are pretty prominent in terms of their place in literature. But these are books that are routinely banned across the country. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing for a second so we can pick up conversation. Unless people want me to leave the list up.
I'm fine with you. Oh. So hopefully everyone was able to catch those titles. There you go. And if you like to see people while looking at the list, if you just hover your cursor over the right edge of that graphic, you can slide your screen over. So like right now, I'm looking at that 10 most challenged books of 2021, and I'm also able to see all of you. So best of both worlds. Let me see if I can also, all right, there is the chat. So if you have a question or a comment, looks like Susan and then Debbie.
Okay. Yes, this is a topic near and dear to my heart because I worked as a library media specialist for several years and also as a public librarian. And intellectual freedom forms the core of that profession because libraries are one of the linchpins of our democratic society. And so we have to do whatever we can to fight against these book bans and support intellectual freedom, because intellectual freedom goes hand in hand with democracy. You really can't have democracy without intellectual freedom. And so I didn't personally have any fights at my libraries when I was working, because I was working in a time that was a little more open, shall we say, or but not completely so. But I didn't have any personal attacks against our libraries that I was working with. So, but I think this is a shame, and it must be fought against with all our might. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. Debbie, go ahead and unmute.
And I think it just goes back to the whole thing of putting down education, or of stifling education, and empowering people. If you don't let people continue to be educated, you have a lot more power and control over them. And that is a huge piece that I think is what's going on, is just keep people ignorant, keep them uneducated, whatever the term they choose to use, and then we can control them a lot better, a lot easier. They don't know what's going on. It's very, and as an educator, it's like tenfold of my anger that I feel toward that. That everybody deserves an education, and to be equal. And it just is, sorry, it's extremely frustrating. I don't have the words to say of how can you deny somebody that education. Doesn't make sense, I guess.
So Mark, just for clarification, in your research of this, are you finding that in school libraries these were banned, or in public libraries these book titles were frequently banned?
Oh, so Amy, thank you for that question, for the clarification. These are books that are being banned in school private libraries. So that's where this list is. So yeah, these are the 10 most challenged books in terms of school libraries across the country.
So Janet, I see you have a question mark in the chat. And before I pass the floor to you, this is so random. That's my disclaimer. So we had several soccer games this weekend, and listening to a lot of NPR on the road, traveling between them. And they were having this discussion about people frying chicken in NyQuil, and that there was like a PSA put out like to not do this. And they were kind of talking, like joking about it. They said, well, before the PSA went out, like 4 people had tried it. And then after the PSA went out, 4,000 people had tried it. So I would wonder if the banning of these books is causing public libraries to receive lots of requests for these books. So yeah, that would be interesting. Janet, go ahead and unmute.
I think that a lot of the argument or the excuse for banning books, and I think it's more likely to be in the South, but I could be wrong, is that we don't want to make our children feel uncomfortable. That is, if they read about the reality of other people's lives, even if they're fictional, the reality of other teenagers' lives, they don't want to know those kinds of things. They don't want to have to feel like squeamish. I think back to Anne Frank, for heaven's sakes, that was banned. And I'm surprised it's not on this list. But the whole notion that we don't want to read anything that would make us feel uncomfortable means we don't want to know anything. We don't want to learn anything. I think it's back to the Disney movie thing. We want the comfortable, familiar, don't challenge us, don't make us think, don't make us learn kind of experience. And I think in opposition to that notion is the popularity of YA books these days. So many young people are learning a lot of stuff about the world we live in by reading YA books, and they're out there on practically every topic. And they're not like, here's everything you ever wanted to know about slavery or gayness or whatever, but they're encased in a fictional story that brings young people to that reading. So I think I don't know if you can stop this unless you live somewhere where your parents are monitoring everything you read. And I know that, by the way, some parents do go into the schools and start pulling books off the bookshelf. So that's my contribution.
Janet, thank you for contributing. I just want to touch on a point that you made. I just dropped in the chat one of my favorite quotes, and if you've ever emailed me and I've emailed you back, you've probably seen this lingering at the bottom. It's from the late James Loewen. Telling the truth about the past helps cause justice in the present. Achieving justice in the present helps us tell the truth about the past. And I think you brought up a really important point of we don't want to make people uncomfortable. But what about BIPOC children that are uncomfortable that these things are not being addressed? And whose comfort do we covet? And who is worthy of our protection? I think that's a whole nother conversation that we could weave into the discussion that we're having.
Amy, thank you for that. I'm gonna flip the screen one more time and show you another list. This is from 2020. Oops. You can see some of the similar books, and we'll talk about, I'll leave that up there for a moment while I talk about, when I see the list, what I think about is I think about my own school experience at times, and I've shared this with some people before, when I think about books written by people of color that were actually part of my school curriculum. I believe this to be true that it wasn't until I was a senior in high school in AP English before I read my first school assigned book by an author of color, which meant that my entire school career was just about reading white authors. It meant that my colleagues and my classmates' whole school career was just about reading white authors. So until we read Ralph Ellis's Invisible Man in AP English my senior year, I'd never read it in school, a book that was part of the curriculum that was written by a person of color. White was the norm. It was what we were being taught the entire time. And it wasn't until we sat down and I had that book in my hand with Ralph Ellis's name on it that it really clicked for me that somebody, as a kid who was an aspiring writer and editor of the high school newspaper, that I could really legitimately be a writer because here's somebody who looks like me doing it. So that, in terms of books that are banned, that mattered. This is why this mattered to me as well, because I think about my own experience, the limited exposure I had to authors of color all through school. And the fact that in 2022, young people are still going through school having those same limited experiences, to the point where where books are being banned. And I'm hoping that that curricula is becoming more diverse along the way, but I equate that so much to the experience I had in terms of, and Ralph Ellis's Invisible Man is actually on a bunch of banned book lists. It's actually not here. I'll actually show you this. So this next slide, other prominent banned books by BIPOC authors. So you can see what's on that list. These are books that are banned, significant bannings across the country in terms of school libraries. So you see Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings, the autobiography of Malcolm X, Their Eyes Are Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, Dreaming in Cuban by Christina Garcia, which I just read a few years ago. Richard Wright's Black Boy, Native Son, his other book, is also banned in a number of places. The Color Purple is banned in a number of school districts. The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan. Invisible Man, as I said, by Ralph Ellison. Beloved, you also saw The Bluest Eye, which was on the top 10 ban list by Toni Morrison. A Lesson Before Dying by Ernest Gaines, and Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. Those are books all written by, they're predominantly African-American authors, but there are a few others in it, but those are books that are banned significantly in school districts across the country. So I'm looking at these books, several of which are like, part of what we would call greater, some of these places that young people, regardless of race or ethnicity, will not get a chance to be exposed to them and read them is sickening to me.
No, Mark, thank you. And I picked up on the subtlety, which I'm using quotes around, of assigned reading. I have a feeling you were tapping into a lot of those authors and more outside of the classroom. But what does it mean to educate someone? And what does a well-rounded education look like? And when children don't see themselves represented, how does that hollow them out over time? And if they don't have supplemental reinforcement in their home, in their community, to say, hey, you need to read this. Hey, sit down, let's read this together. What does that do to our kids? All right, I am going to head back to the chat. Thank you for everyone that is putting information in the chat. Do please read that. Zakai, you put a question mark. Go ahead and unmute, please.
I just wanted to say with regard to feeling like the children are being made uncomfortable, I think it's just absolute nonsense. I'm going to give you sort of a ridiculous analogy, but I think it works within this sort of discourse. Children don't like a lot of things. Let's just say your children they only want to eat nuggets and French fries. But what have you been feeding them prior, so that their palate is only pleased by those things? If you're exposing them to more dishes and more flavor profiles and things like that, those other foods are not going to offend them, because you've already introduced them to a variety of things. Now, once they've gotten a certain age, you've decided that certain things were offensive to their palate. So now, yes, you can't really change that. So I think it's the same thing sort of here. You've decided that these books are not palatable for your children, and you have not made the effort to diversify their outlooks or their reading material or anything that will teach them any type of otherness. So it's not necessarily the children's fault that they're uncomfortable. I don't think they're uncomfortable at all. It is what the parent's palate wants, and therefore that's where they sort of teach their children what's acceptable, what's palatable, what they can do and what they can't do, what's good and what's bad. And that's in that foundation of when the child is growing in what they like, between from the time they're born to the time they're 7. You've already set them in their ways, so you've decided what's palatable or not.
No, thank you for that. And imagine the conflict when the child is potentially interested in embracing other views and perspectives, and the parent is not, and looking at that power dynamic there, it definitely becomes complicated. Kathy, go ahead and unmute.
Parents want burgers and the kid wants sushi. Like, what do? The parents are like, no sushi in my house, but I like it. Well, we didn't teach you that.
Yeah, definitely a struggle. Yep. Kathy, go ahead and unmute.
I just wanted to add that I think one of the biggest parts of education and developing your reading appetite is to be uncomfortable. You don't grow unless you are uncomfortable and you read outside your comfort zone. If you're forever reading within your lane, if you will, you're not going to grow. And part of what we're having this kind of discussion for is to learn and to grow outside of the area where we are most comfortable. And I think that we need to read and learn and study things that do stretch us and make us uncomfortable. That's all.
Well, Kathy, thank you for sharing that. And I think that's a critically important point. And books are safe. You can read a page, and if that was challenging for you, you can put it down. I'm looking to see the book, and I'll turn my camera and go grab it in a minute, but The Half Has Never Been Told. I think everyone should read that book, and it made me so violently uncomfortable. I had to stop reading. I wept. I left it alone for a few days. I came back to it, but it wasn't like conversations and confrontations, which are two different things, by the way. Those can be very scary for people. You know, that type of exposure, but a book, that's like the safest entry point I think we're going to get. You can go at your own pace. You can go back and read for clarity and understanding. So to see books as such a threat is really concerning. Marc, I am going to turn the floor over to you. We are at 6:31. I believe you have one more section that you want to shepherd us through. So I'm going to mute.
All right. Thank you, Amy, for that, for the lead in, because that statement about books, why are books such a threat? It's almost asking the question, why is learning a threat? Why is education a threat? Why is knowledge a threat? Why would you remove information from people? Why would you disallow people from learning? Why would you disallow people from engaging? Why would you disallow someone from picking up something that maybe, or introducing them to something new or different? You know, it is a very unfortunate circumstance that we continue to ban books on a consistent basis, and that certain communities are banning books at an alarming rate. I'm hoping that the thing I'll leave you with as we get ready to move on to some of this last piece around revisionist history is, you know, in your communities, in your school districts, find out what books are on the banned book list. It's worth researching, it's worth noting, and it's worth finding out and understanding the why behind the book ban. And then if you're passionate about it, you know, going and protesting and going and speaking to your school board about getting that book back in the mix. Why is this book on the list? It's one of the greatest books written in American history. Why is this book on the list? What's wrong with it? And making them tell you the why behind it. Because some of these books that I'm seeing on banned book lists, I can't. The other day, it was in Florida as well. They banned the play, A Raisin in the Sun. You know, the kids are not allowed to read that play either, and they're not allowed to show the play or read the play. And I couldn't believe it that was on somebody's list. So we all need to pay a lot more attention to what is being excluded from the education in our communities. Whether you have children or not, or grandchildren or not, you need to pay attention, because if kids are our future, as we all continue to say, our future is looking pretty bleak if they're not learning anything. So, all right. So I'm going to move into, let's see if this works. So I'm going to stop my share for a second. And then I have a piece of audio from NPR that I want to share about not teaching slavery in school, and then we'll discuss. So hopefully, let's see if this comes up and works. I think it did. Let's see. Yep, there it is. All right, so now I'm going to share my screen again and then share the audio with you.
I can't hear it, Mark.
Okay. Is that the right screen? Let's try this again. All right, just a second, we'll try this again. Hopefully this works.
Mark, if you have a link, you can drop that in the chat and I can see if I can queue it up on my end.
Still didn't work?
No, not yet.
Skip that. So the piece was essentially talking about, there we go. All right, everybody can hear me now, right?
Yes.
Okay. So the piece was essentially talking about some of the things that we've been talking about as we're leading in. Not teaching the reason why slavery is not being taught, or slavery is being taught very gingerly is around the idea of the impact that it has on certain populations of children. The idea that it will make certain children feel bad or feel responsible for, or feel guilty about the institution of slavery. The issue with, again, as we've been talking about again, eliminating certain aspects of history and not teaching all of it, is failure to understand the full impact of. You know, why did the transatlantic slave trade exist in the first place? What was the benefit to the transatlantic slave trade? Who benefited from the transatlantic slave trade? What was the abolitionist movement? Why was it opposed? Why was slavery opposed? What ultimately led to the end of slavery, the abolition of slavery in our country and across the globe? It's a very important period of not just US history, but world history. And the idea that we're not teaching that component of world history because it may make a kid feel bad, or that we're assuming that it's going to make a kid feel bad, doesn't relate. Because when we think about some of the things that we're taught in our history classes, you know, when I think about all the Indigenous kids sitting in my classes hearing about how, you know, having us celebrate George Custer, how do they feel? So it's one of those, so it's that question of who are we really, as Amy brought up earlier, whose feelings are we really concerned about? What kids are we really worried about? And I'll shut up because I saw questions pop up. So, and there's a lot more to this, but we'll start with a couple questions.
So Janet, I see you have a question mark in the chat. Thank you everyone who's putting comments in the chat. Hopefully everyone has that open as the discussion continues. Lots of rich information in there, but Janet, go ahead and unmute, please.
I think it's really interesting that as we move into this era of hyper banning of books, there are more and more books that look at slavery in all of its real ugliness, its connection to the development of capitalism in the world and all kinds of other things. So some of us are being more immersed in this, and at the same time that other people are saying, no, let's not talk about that slaves are nice and they loved us like Mammy did, and you know, they loved the plantation and Miss Scarlet and all that crap. So there, in a way, I don't know, it sort of makes it obvious. We're getting more and more discussion of the total depths of the depravity of slavery, and then all the more resistance to some people learning about it, or not wanting their kids to know about it.
Thank you, Janet. So just a question before I hand the floor back over to Mark is, if that occurs, what is your response to that? How do we address that? Or do we choose not to address that? And either way, what does that mean? And what does that help facilitate and create?
So I think that question is it's a hard one to think about, because in my mind, yes, we confront it. Yes, we address it. We don't let it linger. The elimination of history, of anyone's history, the lack of teaching of anyone's history, any aspect of history, whether it makes us feel good or not, diminishes us all. It keeps us from learning the truth. It keeps us from understanding the why behind things. It keeps us from avoiding repeating cruel histories that existed in our past. We have to be able to confront openly and honestly what occurred. And, you know, it's interesting what Janet said, because you are seeing, you know, as you think about some of the things that I was looking at, one of the lists where the 1649 Project, for example, is banned in a number of states now, in a number of schools, and a number of libraries. So as you think about people teaching history and the full history and telling the story, what you see is, in a lot of cases, stories written by people of color about people of color are the books that are being banned and banned more consistently and more frequently. It's not just what's in the history book itself, it's that it's about who's in control of the story and who gets to tell the story. So as the story gets pulled out of traditional history books in classrooms, it's almost in some ways to the detriment, because then people go and seek that information other places. So it has given rise to books and essays and projects like the 1619 Project, whereas history is removed from the mainstream, from certain mainstream sources, other sources are stepping in to provide that history and are becoming accepted in certain places as mainstream history and education. So even though there's damage being done, there is a significant push to keep the education flowing. It's about finding other ways and other avenues to make sure the education is available. So we still need to fight the good fight in terms of keeping it in school and keeping it in our books, but we also need to make sure, as was said by several people, that we're introducing our young people to other sources of information. We too often limit the sources of information that our kids have access to, and we far too often limit the sources of information that we have access to, even though we have unlimited access these days. We tend to focus on 2 or 3 or 4 media where we have access to an unlimited amount. We literally have history at our fingertips that if we want to learn it. But sometimes, so often these days, we're limiting ourselves in what we take in, and then limiting our youth in terms of what we're exposing them to. So we have to start thinking more broadly as well in order to combat what's happening.
No, very important points. So we will hear from Rose and then Zakiya in that order. But first, I just wanted to highlight what Greg put in the chat. I think it's really important. We need to teach not only the truth, but the skills to determine what is truth and what is not. So yeah, education is fantastic. And I think the most important thing that we can do to educate our children is to teach them to be lifelong learners and learn how to learn. That makes sense. All right, Rose, go ahead and unmute, please.
In the chat, I put a link to a New York Times article that compares the exact same textbook, except one is in the Texas school districts and one is in California school districts. And it just points out some of the very obvious differences. One of them, like actually the California one talks about the Second Amendment and explains like what it actually says, and then the Texas textbook leaves it blank. And it talks about Reconstruction, and it says, and in Texas it says the Southerners didn't like Reconstruction because of economic reasons. And then the California one was like, people don't like it because they didn't want to lose their slaves. So it's just a good way to like see that even if everyone has access to the same information, it's not always the same information.
No, thank you for pointing that out. Again, I think I heard it on NPR where it was like the same textbook, like cover, title, publisher, but different content depending on which state it was released in. So thank you for highlighting that and then generously providing that link. Zakiya, go ahead and unmute, please.
Yes, I just wanted to just express just something that I don't think we talked about in this particular conversation, which was the intersectionality of all of those things, because these books are banned for various reasons, for sexual, for racial issues, and those various natures. But I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about from the standpoint of being queer, Black, and a woman. So those are various things that things are being banned for. And we're not just one thing. None of us are just one thing. So yes, the racial disparities are an issue, but also once you add different lifestyles, once you add, let's say just once you add non-binary folks and the things that people are really uncomfortable with now, once you add things that attack the patriarchy, you have a whole ball full of nonsense that yes, you have race, but all of us are intersectional in some way, in some form, and we're all affected by these banned books.
Important point to uplift. Thank you so much for including that in the discussion. All right, so Marc, this has been amazing. We have about 10 minutes remaining because I'll say 8 to 10, because what we like to do at the end is way back when in December of 2021, we had a courageous conversations about resolutions, and we love to support each other and hold each other accountable and hopefully encourage each other by giving some updates, completely voluntary, on what we're doing with our racial justice resolutions from 2021. So we'll make space for that. And then our partner announcements, we'll give those right at the end. If there are others that have announcements, we ask 7 o'clock, the parking lot starts, which is the discussion after the meeting. So if you want to, once Neil opens the parking lot, take your turn to give those outside announcements, we welcome that. All right, Marc, the floor is yours.
So here we go. I'm going to share my screen one last time with a couple of bits of information to kind of close us out. And there we go. Share. All right, so just wanted to, just a couple of pieces, because as we talk about kind of the revisionist history piece, some of the things that have been floating around, some things that have come out in media, some initiatives by government institutions and entities. So I hate to keep picking on Florida, but there's a lot, if people aren't paying attention to what's going on in Florida in terms of education, you really, really need to. So, and again, community action has to be apolitical, but these are things that Governor DeSantis is actually doing and saying. So the thing I want to point out to you is the very last statement down at the bottom, as it says, it was this from an article I took from the Tampa Bay Times. The teachers also said they were shown slides claiming both George Washington and Thomas Jefferson wanted to end slavery, without noting that both men were slave owners themselves. So some of the ideas of kind of the revisionist, of that revisionism. I don't know if people are, George Washington did not comment a great deal on slavery as an institution. However, Thomas Jefferson did write about the inferiority of Black people and wrote pretty prevalently about it. So these are some of the things that are taking place in addition to some of the other conversations around revisionist history, is kind of the repainting or the rebranding of our founding fathers, even though 4 of the first 5 were all slave owners. So just something to pay attention to. And then going back one, this was the other thing that came out of, that came from Florida, is that the sugarcoating of, or the not teaching of, or the elimination of teaching, and it's happened in happening in a few states. I think Oklahoma was the other, teaching about Japanese internment camps, and not to either completely eliminating the educational piece around World War II, or sugarcoating it. Is, I think the last thing I heard was the internment camps were really put in place to keep Japanese Americans safe from other Americans who thought they were harmful. But just two significant circumstances in U.S. history that people are putting different spins on, that I wanted to introduce you to and make sure that people are being aware of. Things like this are happening continuously right now, that people are just making up stuff, quite honestly, that have no basis in history and no basis in fact. The last one I'll share you with is, and we've heard this one for decades, the Civil War was not about slavery. So, and you don't have to read this, and so what I did is I literally went back and looked at all the articles of secession and ordinances of secession from all the states who seceded from the Union, and pulled direct references in their articles of their ordinances to slavery. So just another one. And the last thing I'll leave you with is the conversation around the statement about not all Black people were enslaved. So I keep hearing that. I've heard that statement more and more consistently over the past couple of years. And it is true at the surface. Not all Black people were enslaved. However, there is nuance to that, of course. I went back and I looked at data from census data from like 1800 to 1860. So as late as the 1860 census, which was the last census prior to the Civil War, the last census prior to emancipation, 90% of the Black population was still enslaved. So there was a population of freedmen. It was about 10%. But at no time during the history prior to emancipation was the freedmen's population more than 10% of the population. At its height, it was 1860. And again, that was still just 10% of the population. So while not everybody was enslaved, 9 out of 10 is still pretty significant. And with that, I'll leave it for announcements. But I just a few other tidbits I wanted people to be mindful of as, again, some of this revisionist history continues to hit the air and continues to hit, and now it's starting to hit books and school books, and our kids are starting to be taught it. Please make sure that you're educating yourself so that you can refute some of this revisionist history.
Mark, thank you so much. Courageous Conversations is home for you, and I'm so excited that you could be our guest speaker. Yoga in the Park in August was great, but it feels really good to be back. The link that you have for Courageous Conversations, you can continue to use that. The way we track for data collection, and none of your personal information like your name or email is ever going to be shared, but just to do a count and then demographic information, that link will renew each month, so you can select the next Courageous Conversations. Again, we have some new people here, so I just want to point out we are on the 4th Monday, and we're going to continue to have a virtual platform for these discussions. All right. I have a few announcements that I'm really excited about. Mark, if you could end the screen share. Our wonderful Carrie Dre did a wonderful graphic for our upcoming conference. So I do want to make sure that everyone has a chance to see that. So as many of you know, YWCA Rock County, our 8th annual Racial Justice Conference is coming up. Registration open today. So if you visit our website, that'll give you instructions to get to the platform, which is Whova, to purchase your ticket. Between now and October 28th, which is a Friday, ticket price is $100. Anything after October 28th through the conference, that price will go up to $125. I'll put this in the chat as well. If there is a student that wants to register, whatever time they register, that ticket price will be $50, and they just need to call the Y and then pay over the phone for that $50 student rate. And you'll just have to have a student email to verify student status to get that. I am so excited to have Dr. Dakota Irby as one of our keynote speakers, and also Mr. Paris Eccles. We will be releasing our final press release for the event that's going to give the full slate. I promise you, we have a full day of amazing speakers. I think it's going to be a really great experience. So please go ahead and register and spread the word. A couple other announcements before I yield the floor to my colleagues. On Thursday, September 29th, so coming up, YWCA Rock County is going to be hosting Walk a Mile. Fantastic event. We're in a new location. So please note that we'll be at the Town Square, 69 South River Street in Janesville. We're going to start out with some really powerful, impactful survival stories. We'll have the actual walk, and then we'll reconvene. It's a family-friendly, intergenerational event. So feel free to bring anyone in your household, as well as friends and others that you may know. There's going to be music. I believe I heard there's going to be a bouncy house for kids and some food trucks there. So definitely come out and join as your schedules permit. And I will put the information for tickets in the chat for the conference. Diversity Action Team, Neil, do we have any updates or announcements?
The update about our monthly programs is that we are being creative in terms of how we're doing them now, and haven't figured out quite what is going to happen yet. The idea is to reach out to the younger generation so that among other things that we heard about tonight, they will have the ability to discern between truth and falsehood. And so that's where we're going with it. We don't quite know how we're going to get there yet. So stay tuned.
Perfect. Neil, you continue to keep us updated and we will happily share that information out. We're so grateful for both of our partners with DAT and also Community Action Inc. Are there any updates or announcements from Community Action Inc?
Yeah, I have one. The WEIR applications are being accepted again, beginning, let me pull up the date here. It's not coming up. Actually, it's October 3rd, which is Monday. People will need to complete the new 2023 Energy Assistance application. And all of this information is on the Community Action website.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So Marc, any closing thoughts, ideas that you want to leave us with? And then we will yield the floor to Neil, who will open us up with parking lot.
I just want to say thank you so much for giving me the opportunity this evening. It's always great to visit and see all the amazing things, see all the wonderful people attending, courageous conversations, to see its continued success in the community. It's a point of pride for me because it's an amazing opportunity for us to have conversations from, on a platform that allows us to speak from our living room, literally speak from our living room. So I hope that people enjoyed the conversation. If folks are interested, I will provide Neil and Amy a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. So if anyone's interested to get it, we'll have it. They'll work to have it available. And then people, feel free to reach out to me anytime if you want to continue the conversation offline. Happy to talk to you about it.
Very generous of you, Marc. We are always excited to have you come and lead us in a conversation. That was my not so subtle invitation for you to come back anytime your schedule allows. All right, Neil, the floor is yours. Please close us out, sir, and open the parking lot.
Okay, I guess now Amy's going to turn off the recording. So I want to just